This video is a question and answer session on questions that I have received over the last year or so about the scalar theory of everything, or the STOE. Throughout this presentation, you will see an IA followed by 4 numbers. This is a link to the website, Intellectual Archive, and these 4 numbers reflect the paper that's on that link. The scalar theory of everything is the next level paradigm to explain, within a consistent model, observations not explained by standard models. Part of the model concerns the big, meaning cosmology, and the problems in cosmology of current models is the periodic redshift, asymmetric rotation curves, outer and inner galaxy correlations, gamma ray bursts in the center of the galaxies, etc. And small, which is light interference primarily, and is the basis of quantum mechanics, the STOE has a particle model, that is to say a photon, to explain Young's experiment, the Afshar experiment, and the Hodge experiment. And the STOE predicted a few equations which suggested experimentally the Maxwell's equations need revision. The Hodge experiment, this was referenced just previously. Here is the paper link to that experiment so you can look at it. Plus, there's a couple of YouTube videos about the experiment. What is the origin of the STOE concept? Primarily, it started in looking at human intuition that has been developed and selected to aid our survival. We survive longer if our intuition is in conformance with the universe characteristics. The STOE applies the physics characteristics of the universe at our scale to all scales. The universe is one. This is a fractal model. Things and processes in the universe reflect the characteristics of the universe. For example, birth. In our intuitive world, birth starts from the small, then acquires resources from around the birth to grow. The Big Bang is not such a model. So the stuff of our universe comes into our universe simple and emerges to complexity. And all the simpler stages are still present. For example, bacteria are still present in our world of multicellular life. The 4 forces grew from one, which must still be present. The magnetic force is the STOE answer to this, which is the gradient of the plenum, which also is gravity. We see math in our intuitive world. We see objects with borders and with distance between them. So we count and have geometry. Causation in our intuitive world is our intuition and survival of our memory function suggests one event precedes and causes other events. So our math should have causation to be compatible with the universe. We experience forces. The cause of action is force, not energy, which is an incomplete abstraction. That is to say, friction is not normally included in energy calculations in both quantum mechanics and in the cosmology. Friction is poorly accounted in energy calculations, which results in problems with entropy. The STOE approach started from Newton in his book Optics. Then it jumped to the quasi-steady state cosmology. A reference here is A Different Approach to Cosmology by Hoyle, Burbage, and Narkler, because it suggested a source for the universal birth and growth. The STOE added a sink because heat goes from high source to low of sinks. I started thinking about what is the minimum number of fundamental components of the universe that then emerge to form the more complex structures of the universe. Physics has previously functioned in a reductionist mode to form the universe. The STOE is a holistic emergent model. My attention has been on explaining observations, particularly those observations that present problems to accepted physics models and ad hoc postulates. I concentrate on observations because these have measurements with numbers of standard units which are subject to calculation and comparison. The attempt is to cover a wide range of size scales with the same model. So I'd like to describe spiral galaxy asymmetric rotation curves and many other big scale problems, as you can see in my papers pre-2010, and light interference problem, which are core problems with the quantum models. For example, the same model was applied to galaxy redshift and the Pioneer anomaly in the solar system, and with an eye towards the Pound-Rieppke experiment on Earth. Why do I come up with the names Hod and Plenum to be these two components of the universe? The STOE is a paradigm shift in the sense of Thomas Kuhn. So it is incommensurable with other models, so it has its own terminology. For example, ether has many definitions, such as with and without particles, lattices, etc. So with plenum, I define the characteristics of what this continuous substance is. Likewise with the Hod, the smallest matter particle. Then observational data defines the characteristics that emerge to everything in the universe. So my model so far is two components with algebra and geometry, because math has been so very good at explaining physics. I count Hods and extended plenum, which is geometry. Then the issue was to find the properties of these based on observations, particularly the problem observations. Plenum started as the Newtonian ether from his book Optics, and had several different characteristics to address Maxwell's equations. So it seems Descartes' plenum, boundless and indivisible with longitudinal, not transverse wave propagation, was a better description than most other ether models. But just because the plenum can be boundless does not mean that the universe cannot have a bound or be finite, which in the STOE model it does. Then there is William Thomson, otherwise known as Lord Kelvin, with his plenum, which was a non-dissipative, no friction, as it changed density, and his plenum was ubiquitous in the universe, which is what my plenum is. But it had to be without particle problems. That is, Hods are another component. The plenum plus Hods are what we call matter. Then consider the speed of things. Plenum changes with waves, longitudinal waves, that travel at superluminal speed. Hods, things, matter, travel at a Hod speed, which is the speed of light, the maximum that a matter particle can travel. This is following along of the Lorentz ether theory, which derives the same observations as special relativity. There is only one field, the plenum, and only one force, the gradient of the plenum density. So ignore the ad hoc weak and strong forces, as these derive from particles have charge type models to explain nuclei. This leaves the force, the plenum gradient, is magnetic. Next, the atomic structure can be had by magnetic attraction without the ad hoc presumption of orbits and the theoretical problem orbits create, such as they're non-radiative. So Hods traveling is the model for electromagnetic signals, which is the speed of light, and see my papers on the Biot-Savart law. and plenum vortices, see Thompson and my paper, are electric effects because the speed of the Coulomb field has been measured as much faster than light by Sangro and his team. Another note, the popular description of the interference experiment follows Huygens of single slit diffraction, but the Huygens model has 5 other ad hoc assumptions, including the better known obliquity factor and the phase advance at the plane of diffraction, which has really 2 assumptions in it. First, it's a phase advance, and second, it defines a plane of diffraction, which are not explained by the Huygens or Fresnel slit model. The STOE derives these. Essentially, the Hodge in a photon with a steady plenum magnetic field causes waves in the plenum as it travels. These rays reflect off the mask and don't reflect from the slits and interfere as described by antenna models. So the calculation is the reflected wave from a solid plane minus that part of the slit equals the effect on the photon, which then is the pattern on the screen. Remember, the speed of the waves is very high, as seen in Newton's optics, where he says his ether waves overtake the corpuscles. Solving for the slit part yields the Huygens formula with all the characteristics that had to be ad hoc assumed. How does measurement work in the STOE? In the STOE, only Hodge are detected by our senses and our instruments. That we detect light in our eye is a prime argument that light is Hodge, a particle. The Hodge movement causes waves in the plenum. The plenum waves direct the Hodge. And because the interference experiment suggests it's wave action, it's waves directing the particle Hodge, which then cause the pattern. Note, waves in an ether models would have the plenum waves being detected, which is a problem for superluminal observations. That is to say, ether models, light is not a wave. The reality of the plenum is not directly detected, but has been experimentally demonstrated in the transparent mask experiment, and there's the reference. Why should the magnetic field be primal, being the one field? The electric characteristics were developed first with the idea that particles carried a plus or a minus charge. Ancient Greeks knew that you rub certain things together and you get potentials. When the idea that the nucleus of atoms had to be accounted for only positive charges, which should repel. So the strong and weak forces were ad hoc additions that the magnetic field is primal, removes these ad hoc complications. The measurement of asymmetric repelling magnetic force suggested the gravity is the asymmetry, and there's a paper that suggests this. Remember birth. The previous emergent stages are still present, as is the magnetic field. So other attempted grand unified theory models suggest the primal force is split and lost to our world. This doesn't match very well with our intuitive understanding of birth. The STOE has some predictions. A model should have predictions for it to be valid, at least explain problem observations while reducing to current successful models. So what we're going to cover here is going to be 5 predictions for sure, 2 that might be predictions, and 1 that seems to be developing over the last few years. Now, prediction means data ahead in time. So you make the prediction, then the observation verifies it. And a second thing is that all other models must fail. I mean, it's not a valid scientific theory. If you hold a pen above a desk and you release the pen, that it drops to the desk. Many models suggest this, so that's not really a prediction in the STOE or any other model, because many models suggest this. Some consider a model describing existing data as prediction. I don't. And the prediction must be different from what other models predict and describe, as we said. The STOE model predictions started in 2006, and here's the archive reference about the Pioneer anomaly. These are the three predictions that the STOE had in its analysis of the Pioneer anomaly. The STOE predicted there was a Pioneer anomaly before the flyby encounters, whereas traditional models held there was no early Pioneer anomaly, that is to say, before the Saturn encounter. The other models had the Pioneer anomaly as being sun-directed. The STOE was the only model at the time, meaning 2005, 2006, was the only model to hold it was Earth-directed. The STOE held a decay in the Pioneer anomaly, whereas other models suggested only slight temporary decay around the planet encounters. I might also note that the STOE is the only model to describe all 10 of the Pioneer common characteristics that were pointed out by Anderson in 2001. However, these were known, and therefore describing them is not a prediction. Most other models of the Pioneer anomaly only talk about one or at most two of the characteristics, and therefore they fall short. Also, the Pioneer anomaly paper mentioned trans-Neptunian orbits of Pluto, the TNO orbit of Pluto, caused by the galaxy source. Planet 9 data in and around 2013 papers of TNO objects attributed their orbits to a, quote, planet 9, which is directly opposite to the sun from the Earth. Now, this should be reminiscent for the explanation of rotation curves being caused by dark matter, whereas the QSSC and the STOE model attributes it to the source of the stuff of our universe coming out from the center of galaxies, spiral galaxies, and they're caused by sources. The interference of light in the transparent mass experiment was predicted. Indeed, the experiment was constructed to use the effect to examine in the index of refraction in papers. The Hodge apparatus, a single slit with the second mass placed in the diffraction pattern, was used to examine interference effects of objects. The key is the diffraction variance of intensity from the slit in the second mask. The maybe prediction, I started by noticing Maxwell's equations differ from the STOE. The experiment that rejected the Biot-Savart law, there's the reference, was done because the EM radio signals travel at sea, which implies the Hodge are the elements. However, this seems to conflict with the Biot-Savart law. So the typical experiment was done using a magnet rather than a parallel wire, and the Biot-Savart law, as it's currently stated, was found to be incorrect, experimentally incorrect. The result of this experiment suggested the STOE another experiment on electromagnets. And this is the paper which showed two different types of magnetic field and that the Maxwell's equation should be done. The developing prediction comes from this paper about neighboring galaxies' influence on rotation curves. Recent studies from 2017 and on suggest correlation of spiral galaxies' tilt is related to neighboring galaxies. The following questions come from Ovid here. Ovid is developing a model with only one fundamental component of the universe. He has papers on RG, so you can look them up. The plenum in the STOE is something that is non-material. Within the STOE model, only the HODs cause response to instruments, but the plenum directs the HODs. So turmoil in the plenum causes turmoil in the HODs, and this turmoil is measured as heat by thermometers. Heat is the abstraction. It is the atomic and molecular movement that thermometers measure. The plenum obeys the particular equation wherein the plenum flows from the point of high density to points of low density. The equation that describe this is called the heat equation. This is also the application of the wave equation with inertia and the heat equation without inertia, and the dissipation of friction and entropy, which is another of your questions. The existence of two basic components, plenum and HODs, rather than just one, which is the ether, this is the theory he's trying to develop, is not very likely. What are the lowest level physical properties of HODs? Might the HODs at a level below the magnet actually be a resonant state in the ether, which is basically his argument? If so, our respective theories might be a bit closer, which I kind of agree with. Is my theory, ether is all there is. All particles are resonant states. They're standing waves. I have thought about a one-component system, that is to say the plenum only, being discontinuities in the plenum. However, math discontinuities are to be avoided, in my humble opinion. However, part of the structural requirement of the HODs is that they be rigid disk. Structures like Emmanuel's ball magnet structures are too ill-defined. However, such a thing is very attractive. The HOD is almost certainly not a standing wave. Such a model would be very difficult to construct. I think your model overlooks the 5 weird assumptions needed by the Fraunhofer approach and cannot explain several experiments of light diffraction, edges and opaque objects kind of experiments, and the Hodge experiment, which is the transparent mask experiment. However, you should review the problems Fresnel and Sommerfeld had with wave mechanics applied to interference experiments in comparing to Huygens' explanation. I'd appreciate your thinking on the Hodge experiment. Another reason for the HOD to not be a standing wave, but a steady magnetic field, which generates waves in the plenums, concerns Maxwell's equations. The 3 experiments I did show 2 types of magnetic field, current-induced and a permanent magnet. The 5 papers on magnetic field evolves or emerges through gravity, and the measurement asymmetry in the magnetic field prohibits the wave model without movement. The wave comes from movement. You have a statement problem having the heat equation incompatible with the wave equation to make the STOE encompassing unified field model. Can radiation acting to link wave with heat equations help to make them compatible, like what Planck theorized to link low temperature data connected to high temperature data? Additionally, I see the exponent to a real factor to be real, whereas the exponent to the imaginary factor is imaginary. With the heat and wave equation form solutions. Maybe it is possible to match the 2 at radiation contextual commonality. Well, your HOD out of plenum, like the ice sheet on water, especially seas, meaning HOD rigid entity like an S sheet out of plenum like superfluid, hence distorted superfluid, creating rigid discontinuity from generalization point. That's his question. What is radiation? In the STOE, HODs is a friction and it contributes to entropy. The question, the only context where the wave equation applies is in the propagation of waves by HODs. So perhaps the HOD is vibrating as it moves. That's a subject which I haven't really explored that much on. The exponent to a real function, the STOE suggests exponent to a positive real function, or a 1 over r, which is basically heat equations kinds of solutions. Where are you? I was asking him, where was he going with his suggestion there? Many may disagree, but I dislike imaginary solutions. You see, the rigidity issue. I tried to stay away from considering the plenum having any kind of particle basis and is therefore structureless. This is why the STOE can differentiate cause by noting speed of effects. However, such a thing may be entertained if they have some promise to offer explanation of known problems or predictions. This gets to be kind of a complex issue, of which I have not quite solved yet. According to your STOE model, gravity is equal to the magnetic gradient, not equal to zero, unlike the Maxwell equation. Will distorted magnetic plenum automatically imply it? No, but distortion is called gravity in the STOE model. But also consider the Gauss's law for magnetism, which is the gradient of the magnetic field equals zero, is untrue by experiment, previously referenced. The gradient of the magnetic field not being zero suggests an attractive force, which is gravity. This is another reason for a steady magnetic field being the plenum effect of Hod's 2D surfaces. But the STOE experiment suggested the gradient of the magnetic field is gravity, so the number of Hod's enclosed in a Gaussian surface with the spherical principle times some constant. At a scale greater than the atomic size, the micro application of Maxwell's equation should be rethought. However, a future paper may be a simulation of the delayed choice experiments using a reflected near-standing wave from the apparatus in the experiment. This would be somewhat like the TIQM model, with the reflected wave being the quote from the future wave. Actually, it's a very high speed wave, which Newton suggested. So gravity variation suggests presence of Hod's and is seen as gravity in current models. His question: sources and sinks associated with galaxies, which is the STOE model, does this view give rise to a chicken and egg problem? How can spiral and elliptical galaxies be created if Hod's are required to create gravity? Well, the STOE origin model, like other origin models, is speculative, but it suggests that the first galaxy is a source, one source, wherein the components of the universe enter a void. That is to say, the source is spewing Hod's and plenum. They accumulate, and some are attracted by the gravity back to the source and forms the first spiral galaxy. But some of the stuff is ejected into the void. And this stuff, too, attracts to form elliptical galaxies, not chicken and egg kind of thing, but source first, then elliptical galaxy, which then forms sinks to eject the stuff. After time, the galaxy source splits. These are quasars. See Halton Arb's book on the subject, to form other galaxies. These combine to form more sinks and galaxy clusters, etc. The cluster of sources and sinks form the building unit of our universe, which is the cell. Think over 100 billion years old. Well, all origins start with some fanciful speculation, and the question of where did the first origin come from is always present. Ovid's question: the heat equation as the source of the stuff in the universe, but what requires mass already to be present? Again, in a chicken egg. No, the heat equation is how the plenum behaves. It calculates the plenum density. The source injects both plenum and Hod's. This is Narcolar, and his recent papers over the last 10 years suggested many creation events. You can look it up on archive under MCE or many creation events or nanopolymer. I'm considering two types of speed. One is the flow from sources and around HODs, which limits HOD speed to the speed of light. The other is a superluminal speed of longitudinal waves in the plenum. Now think of a submarine here, by analogy, flowing through the water. The speed of the submarine can't go faster than it displaces the water. That is to say, the water must flow out around the submarine. But the sound waves that can be generated travel much faster than the submarine can through the water. Its question, energy is created and destroyed. Nothing I have come across indicates that. Can you document that by linking to an observation? How does energy enter your force equation for the STOE? That's another one of his questions, but it's related. It's dissipation as in friction and entropy. Again, the model is to explain observations. I submit the STOE explains more than the current models and reduces the current models with appropriate assumptions. If one wishes to keep energy conservation, then there is a host of problem observations left unexplained. That is, the Lagrangian and Hamiltonian approaches fail with dissipation, entropy, and the required forces in several fields. The subtle note here is the STOE deals with forces, not with energy. It doesn't need energy conservation. That is how it overcomes some of the problem observations. So energy conservation is the proposition needing explanation, not its lack. The STOE reduces to the general relativity type model because the left-hand side of the general relativity equation is the plenum. Note, the source has suggested in the QSSC model as a creation field. All we need is a sink field. The STOE explains interference effects better. That's the Afshar experiment, the Hodge experiment, than quantum mechanics. Of its question, what is electrical charge at the physical level, i.e. not described in the way it manifests itself? Electric charge, or the Coulomb field, propagates at a speed much greater than light. Therefore, it is a plenum effect in the STOE model. The STOE suggests charge is vortices, smoke ring type or solenoidal type, meaning cyclone type. This was the paper that was written in 2018 detailing that. However, its question, why such a phenomenal speed, superluminal in the plenum? The longitudinal wavelength has to be very short. If not, the photon will be ridiculously long. How long is a photon? Is it one longitudinal wavelength only? The photon is not a wave, but a particle, and it travels at the speed of light. But I understand the quandary here. The de Broglie frequency wavelength description does match energy in Young's experiment, but there are experiments in which a particle model is better suited. Then there are interference experiments wherein the wave model has difficulty. Afshar experiment and mine, which in general just ignored. So the STOE suggests the true particle photon of a column of HODs. So not wave particularity, but plenum wave and particle photon in the experiments. So the collapse of the wave function thing in quantum mechanics isn't needed. The Bohm idea that the photon has a definite position and momentum at all times is the STOE concept. The uncertainty principle is actually measurement uncertainty of plus or minus 1 HOD in the measurement detection. The link to the de Broglie concept is that in the toy stimulation, coherence is attained by matching of the induced plenum wavelengths. This applies along the direction of travel, which creates pulses of the HODs. separated by a distance dependent on the photon's number of Hods, which is the Hod's energy, and there are two papers showing that. I understand many people shift easily from particle to wave math without any physical justification for such a switch. So they say the energy equals the Planck's constant times the frequency, for instance. The photon energy induces a slightly different wave pattern for each number of Hods. Wave pattern means the distance between the different wave pulses. The resulting plenum wave pattern then directs other similar photons to adopt relative positions in a coherent pattern, which are bands of photons. Note, this then turns out to be a definition of coherence, which is a little funny in quantum mechanics. No, the other photons with other number of Hods are not redirected because the spacing of the Hods receives a net zero force from waves that are not resonant. Resonance is a big deal here. The bands have spacing to reflect the length spacing, which is wavelength. See figure 3-7 in my paper, Replacing Special Relativity, and here's a ResearchGate reference to that paper. So this coherence is a measure of energy and the number of Hods in photons. So there is correlation, even causality, between the number of Hods and energy bands. So what are we seeing in laser, light, and diffraction? Lasers work by one photon particle inducing a wave in the plenum with the particular frequency of the photon. This wave resonates with matching photons in the atomic structure, which then break out of the atom and form a group of photons. This is the stimulated emission part of laser. Lasers do not emit just one photon at a time, although they could emit one packet of a few photons, that is to say coherent photons, over a very short time. The laser speckles is an example of this. So your wavelength light is in the STOE is many photons in an extended region constituting packets. The side dimension, which is perpendicular to the distance the packet is traveling, of this packet may be larger, meters to kilometers or larger, or small, such as less than a diameter of a slit, which then strikes a screen on a very narrow area to look like a spot on a screen. That is, the slit breaks the lateral extent of the coherent packet to be a spot. They hit a small area because of their coherence. Oivid's question: which physical mechanism will set the upper speed limit of the longitudinal wave in the plenum? This is not yet determined, but like sound and water, it should be the plenum density. Oivid's question: if not being like a standing wave, then what might it be that prevents the photon energy from dissipating? As I, meaning Ovid, see it, a standing wave is the only way that nature can contain a certain amount of energy. This, whether in the form of a photon or a particle of mass. The photon's energy is the number of Hods, and the number of Hods in a photon doesn't really dissipate as you're suggesting, as is suggested in the redshift and the Pioneer anomaly papers. This is friction, meaning that the plenum wave variation peels off or spalates, I call it, a given Hod from a given photon, which then causes the photon's energy to decrease. This is friction. Oivid's question: how can a longitudinal wave avoid creating sideways disturbances in the space medium? Let's say disturbances that inevitably will result in a transversal wave. If a medium is continuous and indivisible, that's infinitely differentiable, it has only longitudinal waves. Trend waves are at surfaces, such as water waves between the surface, between the water and the air. But as the Hods go through the plenum, they do introduce some small transversal wave They form the spherical principle through the heat equation, that is to say, a sideways dissipation as the longitudinal wave expands outward from the HODs. However, its question: is superluminal speed part of your explanation of entanglement and the seemingly instant interaction between distant entities? But near infinite speed is just one thing. What might be the connecting link between the entities to make them remain entangled across huge distances? Superluminal speed, and that each particle generates a unique wave pattern in the plenum which can resonate with other like particles. This is coherence. Note, radio waves have a frequency which can resonate in a radio to tune separate stations. Same principle, resonance. Its question: the plenum, why the name and not just ether, as it is different? We covered that earlier in this video, but the difficulty I had early on was the use of the word ether or ether. There are many versions of ether, many of which have experiments that reject them. For example, the luminiferous ether was rejected by the Michelson-Morley experiment. Particle models of ether have also been rejected along the lines of the Fabio model. Then there are lattice models, etc. So I went back to Descartes for his plenum. This touches on another issue: the universal calculation in the universal equation must yield a plenum density greater than 0. This is to satisfy a Mach's principle. The subtlety is Newton, Einstein, etc. require matter to decrease from a background. But where does this background originate? How does it come to be? The STOE and the QSSC have sources to answer that question.